What if America went to war with the rest of the world? That doesn't just include America's enemies, but all of its global allies as well. Would it mean a global disaster? Would it mean the total destruction of America? Or would America prevail? That is exactly what we're going to talk about right now on Life's Biggest Questions. Hello and welcome back to LBQ. Don't forget to like and subscribe and write your topic suggestions in the comments below. If America found itself in a war with the rest of the world, the most logical thing to do would be to pull back and defend itself on its home soil. And using the entire strength of the military, Navy, and Air Force, the US would be able to defend itself for quite some time, possibly until the rest of the world gave up. Keyword, possibly. America's Navy is the biggest in the world. It's so big that the next 8 largest navies combined are nowhere near as powerful or as technologically advanced. So attacking America by sea is not the brightest idea. It's highly unlikely an enemy could get to America by sea. The US also has the strongest and best air force on the planet. It has around 1,400 planes and helicopters. That's a heck of a lot more than everybody else. If there were a war between the US and the rest of the world, the F-22, the world's only 5th generation fighter, would patrol the continental US on its borders and intercept any enemy bombers that got too close. Missile launchers would also shoot down approaching enemy jets, planes, and missiles. So that rules out an attack by air or sea. Then there's the question of a land invasion. The US Army and Marine Corps has around 9,000 tanks, which are the world's most advanced. If any enemy tanks made it to the mainland, they wouldn't stand a chance. Most of the tanks belonging to other countries are older US and Soviet tanks. They would not be able to last long against American tanks that would be firing behind cover. If all else fails and a handful of enemy troops get past the front lines, they have nowhere to hide. America's combat troops are also the most technologically advanced in the world. Like something out of a sci-fi movie, they have weapon sights that allow them to see enemies through dust and smoke, and even around corners. Engineers for the US Army designed a night vision system that allows the Army to see what's behind a corner, allow them to run up to it, and poke their weapon around the wall to fire at the enemy. Soldiers are protected by advanced protective armor, and it's only getting better. And that's just the technology we know about. That means even if every other military on Earth decided to attack the US, that still wouldn't be enough to defeat the US military. Then there's the question of nuclear weapons. The scenario would be much different if the world decided to use nuclear weapons against the US. 9 of the world's countries possess around 15,000 nuclear weapons. The US was the first country to develop nuclear weapons, and it's the only country to ever have used them. America's arsenal is about 6,800 warheads strong. Russia is in possession of the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. They possess around 7,000 warheads. The United Kingdom has 215, France has 300, China has 270, India around 110, 120, Pakistan 120 to 130, Israel has around 80, and North Korea is believed to have around 10. Many or most of these nuclear weapons are many times more powerful than the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in World War II. If any enemies decide to fire a nuclear weapon at a major US city from somewhere like Canada or Mexico, it could likely be shot down. Navy Trident missiles could be fired from submarines in the Gulf of Mexico. Mexico and Canada would become exposed to radiation from those missiles. Here's where the tides begin to turn. A war of this scale would not come cheap. Yes, the US can withstand offensive attacks for some time, but keeping the war going, that's another problem. America would find itself in a situation like Germany at the end of World War II. No resources, no trade, bankrupt. That would be the opportunity for enemy forces to strike. Russia would strike with Canada from the north, Mexico from the south, Europe from the east, China and North Korea from the west. No country on earth, not even the one with the strongest military, can withstand an attack from all sides with absolutely no allies. So what if America then lost a war against the rest of the world? Well, that sounds like a topic for another Life's Biggest Question. America and England are allies, and they have been for the last couple hundred years. England is perhaps the last country on earth that the United States would ever go to war with. But what if America decided to invade England? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. I'm Charlotte Dobre. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments below what topics you would like to see next. There are possible plans that exist that detail hypothetical invasions, and there is likely one drawn up for the US to invade England. In fact, there was a plan for America to invade English territory in the late 1920s and early 1930s. According to a top secret document, this plan was called War Plan Red. War Plan Red outlined a possible invasion of the United Kingdom. The plan assumed that Britain would have the upper hand because of how powerful their navy is. To this day, the Royal Navy is very powerful. It's the second best in the world. War Plan Red also assumed that the UK would use Canada as a base in order to launch a counter-invasion of the United States. Eventually though, the US would defeat Britain by cutting off its food supplies. The plan never envisioned an invasion of England itself, only its territory in the Western Hemisphere. War Plan Red was declassified in 1974. But we're not talking about an invasion of Canada in this video. We answered that question already, and you can check it out at the link clickable visible on the screen right now. In this video, we're talking about America invading England itself. So what would happen? Let's say in an alternate timeline, America is taken over by a hostile regime that ultimately chooses to invade England. This would be a very unfortunate event for pretty much everybody. If America invaded England, there are a couple of scenarios. Scenario number one, the entire world would be drawn into a world war, and everyone would gang up on America. Under NATO, the country that was attacked first would have to be aided by the Allies. Countries that are a part of the British Commonwealth, like Australia and New Zealand, would also likely come to England's aid. Canada, however, would probably choose not to get involved because they are close allies with the US, and they share a border. Scotland would declare independence and offer to help the US, and allow the US to use Scotland for military installations. Perhaps England would also have to appeal to anti-American countries for help, like Russia, China, or Iran. And scenario number two, the rest of the world's military power is nowhere near as great as America's, so rather than risk their own destruction, perhaps every other country would cower, make peace, and allow America to try to take over England. Many countries, especially European countries, need American military support against Russia. The truth is, America doesn't even really need to waste forces to invade England. The UK is an island. All the US needs to do is set up a blockade to prevent anyone from supplying them with imports, like food and oil. Eventually England would have to surrender, and American forces could begin occupation. But that day would not come without a fight. If England was backed into a corner, they would almost certainly employ the use of nuclear weapons. Both the US and the UK are part of what's called the Nuclear Power Club. Both have long-range nuclear weapons. Yes, the US has far more nuclear weapons than England, but all England really needs to do is shoot a few nukes from submarines to totally devastate the US mainland. In the event this happens, the US would likely retaliate and use their own nuclear weapons against England. In the end, there would be no winner. Both nations would suffer greatly. Millions would die, entire cities would be reduced to ashes. The historic city of London would be wiped from the face of the earth. Washington, D.C. and New York would as well. I guess it's a great thing that the US and Britain are allies. It's highly unlikely America would ever invade England, but we at Life's Biggest Questions believe you should never say never. US-Chinese relations have always been somewhat complicated. Both countries rely on one another economically, but both countries also acknowledge that the other could be a potential adversary. But what if that delicate relationship suddenly became strained? Today, Life's Biggest Questions asks, what if the United States invaded China? Hello and welcome back to LBQ. I'm your host, Charlotte Dobre. As always, make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe and let us know in the comments below what topics you would like to see next. Over the last few years, China's military is becoming more technologically advanced, and it doesn't have obligations to the rest of the world the way America does. China has nuclear capabilities, satellite technology, and military forces on the ground, air, and sea. China is the world's runner-up for military spending after the United States. According to Abraham Denmark, Senior Vice President for Political and Security Affairs at the Natural Bureau for Asian Research, a war between the US and China would be disastrous for both sides. So in order to invade China, the US would have to have a very good reason. Perhaps if China got into conflict with one of the United States' allies, like Japan or South Korea, and the United States would be forced to intervene to defend those countries. But if the United States invaded China without a good enough reason, that would make them the aggressor and effectively a war criminal. And being a war criminal does not put you in the best position when it comes to needing allies. The ability to win the war would depend on the political climate at the time, and which countries would back up the US and which would back up China. If the United States invaded China, it would need to use its current allies that surround China to serve as bases and launch points. And having those allies really close to China also poses a problem. If the US wanted to strike China with a nuclear missile from the mainland, that missile has to fly through the airspace of the surrounding countries. In addition, the fallout from that missile would affect all of the surrounding countries. China has the geographical advantage. In the event that the United States invaded China, China could use nuclear weapons to strategically take out all of the bases that the US requires. It could destroy bases like the port of Yokosuka, the Kadena Air Base, and effectively stop the war in its tracks. If this happens, it would be extremely difficult for the US military to continue an operation. Its aircraft need bases to refuel. America would then have to transport its supplies all the way from mainland America or from Australia. Not to mention, what if India, North Korea, or Russia came to China's defense? Russia could attack the United States from Alaska. Canada would then have to take a side. If they side with America, it's in the middle of a conflict. If it sides with China, a land route opens up for Russian forces. Either way, Canada would have to get involved, and all of a sudden, an American invasion of China becomes a full-fledged world war. A war that the United States would very likely lose. Yes, the United States has the best military the world has ever seen, but you don't always need the best military to win a war. Many historians will say that the first rule of military strategy is to never get involved in a land war in Asia. An invasion of China would be a bloodbath, especially for Chinese civilians and US troops. Millions would die initially, then after the first waves of troops died off, the US would have to send more troops into the bloodbath. It would go on until both countries were so badly wounded, militarily, politically, and economically, that they would be forced to to stop. American influence in Asia would surely be strained following a war with China, especially if they had been the aggressor. America would never have the same influence in the East again. What do you think would happen if the US invaded China? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked that video, you should also check out What If the United States Invaded England? Or What If the United States Invaded Canada? Clickable on the screen right now. For now, I'm Charlotte Dobre, and you've been watching Life's Biggest Questions.
The United States of America has a complicated and checkered history with Russia. The pair were embroiled in a Cold War that lasted the best part of 45 years. Despite being great rivals, the USA Armed Forces and the Russian Red Army have met in battle just once. But what if all of that changed? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions, the channel that likes to investigate all lines of inquiry. I'm your host Rebecca Felgate, and today we're asking, what if America invaded Russia? Before we get into this video, why don't you guys let me know what your D-Day plan is? If this ever happens, then D-Day's probably coming. Also, while you're down there, why don't you like this video and share it with a friend? What if America invaded Russia? Well, I mean, it's a bit of a death wish, isn't it? Since the end of the Cold War, documents have been released that have outlined both countries' passion for mutually assured destruction should the other strike. So, what would this mean in an invasion? If the United States invaded Russia, it would be considered an act of hot war. The pair have not been involved in a country-to-country hot war ever. They fought on the same side in World War I and II. Things only got intense after the Second World War, and both countries were threatened by the other's opposing ideals on how to build a strong nation. That being said, Russia and America have engaged in combat once before in history, 100 years ago in 1918. The USA forces joined the Russian White Army to stop the Bolsheviks, which was more wading into a civil war, and their mission wasn't a resounding success by any means. If the USA was seriously going to invade Russia, they would have a serious plan of attack, but as we know, if the USA was seriously going to invade Russia, they would have a serious plan of attack, but as we know, the devil and maybe Russians fall with the best laid plans. Would the US ever manage to even make landfall? Russia is vast, like seriously vast. It basically spans the east to the west, and there is a point in the world, believe it or not, where Russians and Americans can practically look eye to eye. Let me draw your attention to the two islands between the far-flung East Russia and the very, very far west of Alaska. This is Big Diomede and Little Diomede. One is owned by Russia, the other by the USA, and they're separated by just 4 kilometers. The United States could invade this land with little more than a hop, skip and a jump, although there would be little point in securing this island, and fun fact, for fact geeks like me, if war did ever break out between the islands, the date the war started would be contested. The islands straddle the time and date line. Despite being 2.5 miles apart, they have a time difference of 21 hours. That little tidbit aside, invading Russia in this way is pretty futile in traditional war, which would see a country securing the capital for a victory. Moscow is better accessed from Europe. I guess, unless that wasn't the objective, maybe the United States wants to own or annex the land that borders China and North Korea in order to make an Eastern power play. Either way, let's be clear about this. There's absolutely almost no way in which the United States could launch a surprise invasion on Russians. In our modern age of surveillance, the Russians would see it coming. If they even got a whiff of a United States invasion, they would be ready to defend their land with full force. In some ways, a good old-fashioned land invasion would be better news for Russia and the United States and the world. Better so than a bomb anyway. Any drop of a nuke could have disastrous consequences and would be met with full retaliation. During the Cold War, it was made clear that when it comes to Russia and the United States, the only way they play war is by threatening nuclear action. It's never been carried out, but then neither country has ever really invaded the other. If the United States made the unprecedented move to invade, depending on the death toll of the Russians, Vladimir Putin may be in a slightly more reasonable mood to act like a statesman rather than a warlord. This would not be the case if a bomb was dropped. If the US did invade, Putin would hold a press conference calling for Americans to withdraw, else they feel the full force of Russian anger. NATO would likely be scrambled to hold a crisis meeting, and traditional US allies would be confused and under pressure to pick a side. Would the United Kingdom, for example, support the United States in an invasion if it were unprovoked? World leaders wouldn't want to side with an aggressor, especially not China, who have had stern words on the topic in the past. It will all boil down to circumstances. If the United States has what they see as fair reason, perhaps they will garner some more support. If they had support, we could have another world war on our hands. If the invasion was unprovoked, however, perhaps this would be enough to convince Putin to press his polished and preserved red button, which Sears once boasted could lead to the total annihilation of the United States. Would Trump or whomever is in power have time to retaliate? Would both Russia and the USA be destroyed in the fray? If so, perhaps China will find the space to rise. With the US destroyed, the world power and ethos would shift. Perhaps this would be the rise of the first Eastern powerhouse, and these videos would be hosted in either Russian or, more likely, Mandarin. Definitely something for you guys to consider. Of course, who really knows what would happen if America invaded Russia, but I can't imagine it would be good.
What if America invaded Canada? Hello and welcome back to Life's Biggest Questions. I'm Rebecca Felgate, and today we're imagining a situation where relations between allies Canada and America turn sour and the United States decides to annex his neighbor. Boo! While the thought today seems pretty wild, the United States did try and fail to conquer Canada in 1812. A series of blunders meant that the much bigger American army embarrassingly failed to gain any traction. Then, in the 1920s and 30s, America drew up War Plan Red, which involved America declaring war on Britain and seizing Canada, still part of the British Commonwealth. Of course, this never happened, but the thought was there, and I would imagine, even if it is never admitted to, old plans to invade the North still exist somewhere today in the Pentagon. These days, the American army is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the world. In the States, they have 1.3 million active soldiers and 800,000 in reserve. Canada, well, Canada has 68,000 active soldiers and 27,000 in reserve, so to say that the Canadian is a fraction of the size of the American is a bit of an understatement. Canada falls short of America in almost every single military way, plus America has over 7,000 nuclear weapons.
Do you think America should nuke Canada?
No.
If you nuked Canada, the amazing thing would be the element of surprise. Them would never expect it.
Canada has zero. Throughout the past 100 or so years, Canada's biggest defense has been their friendship with the United States. If America decided to attack Canada, it is more than likely the Canadian army would not and could not put up a fight. Back in the 20s, when America were creating their Plan Red, Canada were devising Defense Scheme Number 1, which acknowledged that a preemptive strike on America would be suicide and their only real options were to retreat or to surrender. The invasion would be swift, but it would not be bloody. America would not want to spill unnecessary Canadian blood, and if there were any targets for explosive weapons, they would be military areas. A sweep of targets from east to west could be easily wrapped up in one day. The easiest entry points would be into Quebec from upper New York State, Vermont, and Maine. Moving into Ontario would be a two-pronged affair from Buffalo and from upper New York into the Canadian capital of Ottawa. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba would be entered from the upper United States of America, with Winnipeg being particularly easy to seize. Entry into Vancouver and the widest British Columbia would be easiest from Seattle, although entry up the Strait of Georgia would be more difficult for the United States Army, with Vancouver Island a good area to defend from. Most of northern Canada will be easily accessed from Alaska, with a strong army base developing in Anchorage. Newfoundland and Labrador could be attacked by the Navy from the sea. It is possible that other countries would consider coming to Canada's defense, most likely the United Kingdom and France, because of the country's historic relationship. But even then, would these two nations want to face the biggest military in the world at a risk of great personal loss of life? Maybe. A third country that may want to get involved is Russia. While Russia has no loyalty to Canada, it may see the opportunity of a distracted United States, as well as the greater threat of an expanded United States of America, which would then become the biggest country in the world. Worldwide politics aside, for the Canadians, after an initial period of upheaval, life would be reasonably similar. Instead of provinces, the land would be divided into states, but cities would remain very much as they were, just with American flags rather than Canadian. At this point, I would imagine Quebec would attempt to dislodge from the country once and for all, with the French divide becoming even more apparent in a colossal United States. The drinking age across the country would be changed from 18 in Quebec and 19 in the rest of Canada to 21. Although the good news is that if you live in Ontario, you may actually be able to buy alcohol in regular stores. A small victory. Canadians would return to the old imperial system, something America clutches onto with a strange defiance. And of course, the money would change to the American dollar, which again may not be the worst thing. Eventually, Canadian culture would bleed in with American, with the quirks Canadians enjoy becoming state things rather than characteristics of national pride. I, for one, living in and loving Canada, think it would be a very sad day. But guys, don't worry, America won't invade Canada. Probably not, anyway. If they did, I am sure the Canadians would still find a way to say sorry about it.